If you were a fan of shooters in the year of our Lord 2007, you almost certainly played Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. This is the game that shot the series ahead of the entire shooter market, and into a lead that arguably holds nearly 2 decades later. This was 2007's single best-selling game, and it had to compete with the likes of Halo 3, Crysis, Portal, Assassin's Creed, Uncharted, Team Fortress 2, and Mass Effect, just to name a few. Despite everyone and their mum playing this game, and likely finding a father figure in Captain Price, we expect most people don't actually remember what the hell happened in the story. In fact, when we asked you guys a few months ago, our suspicions were confirmed, because 77% of you admitted that you couldn't explain it. You all get a gold star for honesty, that's for sure. After going back and playing it all these years later, it's hard to really blame anyone for not knowing what was really happening. The game came out ages ago, and a lot of people probably played this when they were super young, and the story itself almost seems to be intentionally convoluted at times. But oh boy, we'll get around to that. Our hope is that this video can be something of a retrospective, but rather than specifically focusing on the gameplay itself, instead, looking at Modern Warfare's story and how it's aged eerily well when considering the headlines of today. We also wanted to delve a bit into the development process for making a game like this, and why despite its monumental success, the developers had to fight so hard to actually get it made in the first place. As an added bit of fun, we also interviewed a handful of military experts to see just how realistic some parts of the game would actually be. If you've ever wanted to know how close the AC-130 mission compares to real life, then you've certainly come to the right place. Much of COD 4's storytelling is a barrage of blink-and-you'll-miss-it lines told through stylized intelligence briefings. In the opening cutscene, we find out that Russia is in the midst of a civil war, with government loyalists clashing with ultranationalist rebels. Meanwhile, a man by the name of Khalid al-Assad is making waves in the Middle East. Who al-Assad actually is, we don't quite know, but he's implied to have taken control of vast amounts of minerals, and is explicitly said to be, quote, the second most powerful man in the Middle East.
Currently the second most powerful man in the Middle East.
Already there's a lot to unpack. Although not explicitly stated, the story is set in the year 2011. And as we can tell, many nations are experiencing quite a bit of instability. Viewers may have to use their imaginations here, but just pretend for a moment that there's a shadow conflict raging in the Middle East and a war within Russia. The Russian Civil War portion is perhaps more relevant today than it was in 2007. Viewers may remember the short-lived rebellion in June 2023, where the leader of the Russian Wagner military group shot down several Russian helicopters on its road trip toward Moscow. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin would state that although Russia's war in Ukraine was based on bullshit lies, he only started the rebellion so that Russia might fight the war more effectively. He would quite famously be assassinated by plane crash 2 months later. To make it even closer to reality, Wagner Group itself has also been branded as an ultra-nationalist organization, and ultra-nationalist Russians are who you'll be fighting for a large majority of this game. This faction is also fighting to return Russia to its Soviet-era glory, which really makes you wonder if life truly does imitate art. Anyway, we learn all this information through a 40-second cutscene and land in the shoes of Private Soap McTavish, a brand new recruit for the British SAS. Gaz, your squad's second-in-command, shows you how to shoot before uttering one of the many iconic lines that will ring out in infamy.
Remember, switching to your pistol is always faster than reloading.
He'll then compliment your ability to murder fruit.
Nice! Your fruit killing skills are remarkable. Captain Price wants to see you.
Moving along, we meet the man himself, Captain Price, my king. Price then puts you through the training course, which is when we learn that Gaz is actually slightly faster than Price. Remember this for later. Moving on to the game's first real mission, and we're told that a package is aboard an Estonian freighter currently traveling through the Bering Strait, which, for those who don't know, is this patch of water. The game doesn't tell us what the package actually is, but we're told that people on board are armed to protect it. Good enough for us. Although we don't know it yet, the start of the first mission really shows us why Captain Price is the real main character of the series. Cool as a cucumber, extremely good at what he does, and the most plot-critical dialogue in the game. If you were being sent into hell, this is the guy you'd want leading you there. The game then gives us the green light to repel whilst also showing us a red light, and a few seconds later, we're aboard the freighter. We should probably mention that in the United States, this was the first game in the series to get a mature rating, and with first contact contact with the enemy, you can see why. The squad immediately lights up the crew helming the ship, a man who had one too many VBs and even crew members who were having a nap. A few moments later and your helicopter support mows down half the ship and you're treated to yet another iconic line.
I like to keep this for close encounters.
The team fights its way through the cargo hold, before eventually finding a nuclear package. The game doesn't explicitly tell you this at the time, but the nuclear package came from the aforementioned Russian ultranationalists, and was intended for Khalid al-Assad, our generic Middle Eastern bad guy. The ultranationalist forces aren't so thrilled at having their cargo confiscated, so they hit the freighter with an airstrike and the Price gang narrowly escape with their lives. What a fucking deserved title card drop. Also, if you haven't noticed by now, all of the footage is from the 2016 remaster, which is probably how you remember it looking anyway. Mission 2 is quite unique, as it's very unexpected for what is usually a Hollywood action blockbuster style of shooter. The player lands in the shoes of President al-Fulani, a man who has been captured by the Khalid al-Assad forces, who are in the process of overthrowing the current government. The government of which country? We don't actually know, because missions in this region are always referred to as the Middle East. If we look at the satellite cutscene, however, it seems to take place somewhere in Saudi Arabia, but that's never actually mentioned in the game. The president's name, Yasir al-Fulani, also seems to be designed to be generic. Yasir roughly means prosperous or successful, while Fulani is literally an Arabic placeholder name. It'd be like calling someone President John Smith. Anyway, John President is thrown in the back of a shitbox, and we're forced to look out the window as the country goes to complete shit. The rebellion is executing civilians, raiding houses, and violently crushing any opposition. It's interesting to note that this game was set in 2011, which was right in the middle of our real-world Arab Spring, a series of protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions within the Middle East, which also saw harsh government crackdowns. As crazy as it might seem, many of the things the player witnesses would actually happen 4 years after the game is released. We should mention that this sequence also acts to credit the game's developers, many of whom have now become famous in their own right. Jason West and Vince Zampella would famously be fired from Infinity Ward a few years later, but go on to found Respawn Entertainment, the creators of Titanfall and Apex Legends. Zampella especially is still something of a living legend in the shooter space, as he's very uniquely headed Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, Titanfall, and Apex Legends, and has arguably always been at the helm during the heyday of each franchise. Zampella has had such a good track record that EA put him in charge of the entire Battlefield franchise following the less than well-received release of 2042. Another famous name in the credits is Mark Rubin, a man who most recently headed X-Defiant, the Call of Duty-like shooter which went on to be Ubisoft's fastest ever game to reach 1 million unique players. One more notable figure is Ryan Lastimosa, the namesake of Ty Lastimosa, the mentor character in Respawn Entertainment's Titanfall 2. Needless to say, this game really did have the SEAL Team 6 of shooter developers, and in an interview after the game's release, a senior developer attributed much of their success to the team's very low turnover. We could talk more in depth about how this would come back to bite Activision in the arse, but we'll leave that for a breakdown of Modern Warfare 2 if viewers actually want that. Back to the mission, and John President is eventually thrown out of a car, lined up against a post, and shot in the head by Khalid al-Assad. We don't know this at the time, but the gun is given to him by the leader of the Russian ultranationalists, Imran Zakhaev. The beauty of this scene is that Zakhaev hands al-Assad the weapon out of frame of the camera, signifying his desire to stay in the shadows. Zakhaev's plan is to provide nukes to al-Assad to divert Western attention away from the war in Russia and onto the Middle East, which once again just aged so fucking well. Viewers who have been keeping up with the world news will know that Iran has been stirring up a lot of shit in the Middle East. This has included funding militant groups to attack shipping vessels in the Red Sea, arming and funding Hamas, and even launching the single largest drone attack of all time on Israel. Although not directly involved, Russia has very close ties with Iran, and Russia itself has benefited greatly by having Western attention diverted to the Middle East, as opposed to the war in Ukraine. Aid packages, headlines, and political capital have been diverted away from Ukraine and into the Middle East, which is exactly what happens in-game. An opinion piece article in 2007 from Destructoid actually called the plot of Modern Warfare essentially irrelevant, and it might be insane to think that the story is is more relevant today than when it first released. Pulling away from the Middle East, and we now come back to Captain Price and company, who are starting their next operation in the Russian Caucasus Mountains. Their mission is to save a Russian named Nikolai, their ultranationalist informant who tipped them off about the container ship. The plan is to meet up with Russian loyalist soldiers who will then assist with the extraction.
Loyalists, eh? Are those the good Russians or the bad Russians?
Well, they won't shoot us on sight, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, well, that's good enough for me, sir.
You said it, Gaz. The next few encounters on the way to the Loyalists are pretty funny. In the first encounter, Gaz pulls off maybe the slowest room breach in history, and we should once again remind everyone that this man was tested to be the fastest in the SAS for specifically room clearing.
Good work. There should be a few more guard posts up ahead.
A bit further along, and Gaz tells Soap to plant a claymore on the doorway of a house, before attracting the enemies outside. Playing this in 2007, this was the coolest thing ever. But come to think of it, this is such a terrible thing to do when they're going out of their way to be quiet. Gaz is, however, known to be a cheeky kind of guy, so this kind of shit is very much in character. Anyway, the gang meet up with the Loyalists, which is led by a guy called Komarov. Price and Komarov seem to know each other, because when he goes to leave, this happens.
Not so fast. Remember Beirut? You're with us.
I guess I owe you one.
Bloody right you do.
That's a pretty fun interaction, but if you wanted to know what happened in Beirut, be prepared to die with that question, because you won't find it here. So the gang move out and take part in a battle between the Loyalists and the Ultranationalists, and Komarov convinces Price that everything will just go smoother if the team helps their men turn the tide. Eventually after Komarov is like, "Please bro, just one more Ultranationalist bro, I promise bro!" Gaz ruffles his feathers to make him tell us where Nikolai is hiding. The team then make their way to the house where Nikolai is being held hostage, and while Gaz cuts the power, Soap and Price sweep the place with the help of night vision goggles. It's important to know that the invasion of Iraq kicked off just 2 years before development on Modern Warfare began, and a huge advantage for American troops at the time was the use of night vision. The ability for an entire army to see in the dark, while the opposing side couldn't, proved to be such an enormous benefit during the invasion that many US infantry greatly preferred fighting at night to leverage this advantage. This section in-game really does a good job to show how much of a difference this kind of tech advantage can make. This point comes at a good time, because after you get Nikolai on the escape chopper, we once again return to the Middle East. After al-Assad executes John President on national television, the United States concludes that his right to live has now been revoked. When Modern Warfare was written, the United States invading a Middle Eastern country was just another Tuesday. So although less believable now, it was very fucking believable back then. It's almost insane to think that this part of the story was seen as way more believable at the time, while the Russian storyline was supposed to be more outlandish. In any case, we now jump into the shoes of Sergeant Paul Jackson from the 1st Recon Marine Corps. The Marines land in a small town where al-Assad is believed to be broadcasting propaganda, and you're tasked with fighting your way to the news station to capture him alive. The Marine missions in Modern Warfare are very distinctly different from those with the SAS, because while Captain Price and company are often operating quietly and behind enemy lines, the Marines don't have the word subtle in their vocabulary.
They're here to shoot bad guys and eat crayons. And they were all fucking out of crayons.
The first mission for the Marines is about what you'd expect. Your squad, led by Lieutenant Vasquez, fight your way through a stereotypical Middle Eastern town, against a bunch of people who speak Arabic and own AK-47s. In an interview after the game's release, a senior developer explained that the first year of the game's 2-year development cycle saw the team only focus on Middle Eastern battles. Their intention was to draw from real-world modern conflicts, and as you might imagine, most of those were centered around the Middle East. The problem with this setting is that these real-life conflicts tended to be insanely one-sided. The US invasion of Iraq saw America take the entire country in less than 6 weeks, and it only lost around 200 troops for the entire campaign. The developers felt that directly adapting these battles wouldn't be nearly as interesting, so they would go back to the drawing board to attempt to find an opposing force which would be more threatening. This would ultimately be an excellent decision, as it would add in the Russian storyline, as well as the British SAS characters, which would remain at the center of the Modern Warfare trilogy. Another fun tidbit is that the team decided to swap out the voice actor for Captain Price at the very last minute. This decision was made so late in development that they wouldn't have time to fix it if it turned out bad. Quite fortunately, Billy Murray absolutely fucking crushed the role and earned himself the spot as the main character. In about 10 minutes, the Marines make their way into the Swag News Team headquarters, kill more people shooting at you Arabically before discovering that the propaganda being broadcast is just a recording. Al-Assad is nowhere to be found. Now, most channels might move past this point, but regular viewers will know that these days we're pretty much just a news team who happens to like video games. With this in mind, one of the advantages of spending 5 years covering world conflicts is that you tend to meet all kinds of different people in the military, meaning we can ask them about all types of details to check for authenticity. In this case, we went to a former Australian military intelligence analyst to see how realistic this situation might be. For context, this mission roughly takes place 12 hours after John President is shot in the face, meaning the United States had all this intelligence on al-Assad's supposed whereabouts and had troops on the ground in half a day. In an earlier cutscene, we learned that the US is keeping an eye on al-Assad, so maybe that means they were already mostly prepped in case shit hit the fan. Our intelligence analyst also commented on this extremely fast turnaround to start the invasion. To put it into perspective, the United States started its invasion of Iraq a whole 6 months after George Bush declared a war on terror. The only way we're able to really justify action this quickly in-game is either the US was already locked and loaded, or they considered al-Assad a serious Avengers-level threat, which is also very likely. In terms of the mission itself having bad intelligence, our analyst admitted that it's not all that uncommon for intelligence to get something wrong, although he explained that in this situation, quote, something like this is likely multiple failures of multiple different types of intelligence. In his view, the only way such drastic action could ever be justified so quickly would be intelligence from a source which has had a beyond exemplary track record of providing exceptional intelligence, combined with a commander who was willing to be extra gung-ho in their decision-making. As he explains, those working in intelligence gather as much information as they can, but it is ultimately up to the commander how they decide it should be acted upon. He also took issue that the mission was given to 1st Recon Marines, commenting that they'd almost certainly give this to Navy SEALs if al-Assad was so important. If we're being generous, however, maybe the short planning window meant that the US military just had to grab anyone they had in the area, and the Marines were just the obvious choice. In this case, the commander in charge would have determined that the risks were acceptable for what was at stake, and considering we're dealing with potentially nuclear weapons, this is probably a reasonable response. We should probably point out that although not considered special forces, 1st Recon Marines don't fuck around. In fact, during their 7-month 2010 deployment to Helmand Province in the Afghan War, they eliminated over 300 insurgents without losing a single man. At the time, Lieutenant James Mattis even called them, quote, the deadliest battalion in Afghanistan right now. Needless to say, these aren't the kind of guys you want pointed in your direction. For shits and giggles, we also asked our analyst about the pre-mission cutscenes in the game, which are all supposed to be intelligence briefings. As you might imagine, he stated that most briefings he worked on were mostly just Word documents or PowerPoint presentations, which he admitted weren't nearly as cool as what is depicted in-game. As a fun bit of trivia, the intel cutscenes were actually some of the only bits of content that Infinity Ward outsourced, and all of them were finished in just 2 months. What's even crazier is that they were completed so late in development that if they weren't good, it would have been impossible to fix them. Getting back on track, the next mission sees the Marines tasked with saving a tank crew in the middle of a nearby city, which is currently being overrun by bad guys. You wouldn't find any info on whether this high-intensity style mission was based on anything in real life, but it looks to be inspired by the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004. This would have been shown on TV about the same time the developers started working on the game, so it's likely that they drew inspiration from those images. Much like the previous mission, our second level with the Marines isn't quite as flashy as the ones where we get to tag along with Captain Price, but this was actually by design. When making the game, the developers didn't want the combat experience to feel too techy and stray too far from the grittiness of previous titles. The Marine missions were the answer to these concerns, because the Marines tended to get a lot of their equipment secondhand from the army. In-game, the Marines serve as a more traditional soldier soldier experience, using weapons given to the average grunt, while the SAS are the covert special forces who get all the shiny new toys. This isn't to say that the Marines don't get any cool shit to play with, like this Batman anti-freeze spray that can instantly cut through a chain-link fence. We couldn't find any evidence that this kind of spray exists in real life. And our intelligence guy had also never heard of this kind of equipment. In his opinion, it would be more believable that military R&D was able to develop the spray than for anyone to ever trust the Marines to have it. Before working in intelligence, our anonymous expert also specialized in light armored vehicles. So naturally, we asked whether shooting tanks with a Javelin rocket launcher in this mission would be a realistic situation. To paraphrase his response, absolutely fucking not. According to the Australian Army website, Javelins have a minimum range of 65 meters, meaning if a tank is locked on any closer, the launcher literally won't let the operator fire. In-game, we shoot from around 30 meters away, but whatever. For all the things to nitpick in this game, this is pretty small. The mission itself is pretty standard, as the squad fights through a ruined city, saves what's left of the tank crew, and calls in helicopters to ex machina the whole situation. After it's all over, however, Lieutenant Vasquez is like, "Good job, guys. Anyway, while you were busy fighting, I was drawing a fun little map on the side of this tank. Hope you like it." While the Marines are taking a breather, we then jump back to the SAS crew, who were shot out of the sky within an hour after taking off. The team crashed still within Russia. Their pilots are dead, and the ultranationalists have sent out troops to look for any survivors. Only a few minutes ago, you were fighting alongside half an army of Marines, but now you're a band of isolated fugitives with whatever weapons you can find. Even outside of the Middle East, you're clearly still in a country which has been ravaged by a civil war. And one of the first things you do is witness the ultranationalists hassle an old man near his home. These are the bad Russians, after all. Much of the mission is spent sneaking through the rural fields, getting into scrappy firefights, and Captain Price getting annoyed at Nikolai for blocking a cellar doorway.
What the bloody hell are you waiting for? Get down those stairs!
The team eventually just happened to find a Stinger missile system lying around in a barn to take care of the helicopter harassing you all mission, before Captain Price pats you on the back for a job well done.
Good work, Soap. Everyone on me, let's move out.
From our own limited research, it's not clear why a Stinger would be lying around in a barn in rural Russia, because the US never sold units to Russia. With this in mind, however, Imran Zakhaev was known to be a career weapons dealer, so it's not unreasonable to think that he got his hands on them somehow. In any case, a few minutes later, and you're told that an AC-130 gunship has arrived to walk you to the extraction point. And in just a few seconds, you're shown just how absolutely terrifying this thing can be. An invisible angel of death that can do more damage in a few seconds than your entire team inflicted in the entire mission. And for the next level, you'll be in the gunner's seat. Although only about 10 minutes long, this mission would go on to be one of the most iconic in the franchise, giving players a terrifying modern-day power fantasy, the closest thing you might find to being a god of death. With no way for enemies to actually hurt you, the only way for the player to fail is to fire on your friendlies, fire on civilians, or fire upon the church in the middle of town. A clever way to give the player specific rules of engagement. Curious about the level of realism for this mission? We were lucky enough to speak to a former sensor operator for an AC-130U. For those who don't know, the sensor operator is the guy actually sending the rounds. So for someone to evaluate this mission, we basically won the fucking lottery. This fucking legend actually wrote us a referenced 3,200 word breakdown of this mission, with pictures, timestamps, and even a fucking glossary. In the interest of time, we've cut this down so we don't get lost in the source. But in the meantime, welcome to yet another episode of Things That Civilians Probably Shouldn't Know. White Light might be smarter and more popular with the e-girls, but he never brought this to his video game essays. Once again, for obvious reasons, our sensor operator wanted to remain anonymous. So for simplicity's sake, we'll just call him Ned. Going back to the end of Mission 6, Ned immediately noticed that Captain Price seems to have worked with an AC-130 before. However, Price himself appears to be communicating directly with the fire control officer, as opposed to the nav. This isn't unheard of, but this is usually only done when the gunship is communicating with multiple different fire teams on the ground. Ned also points out that the call sign used doesn't follow proper naming conventions, but we'll let that one slide. The first time we see the AC-130 in action, Captain Price calls down a danger close fire mission on a bunch of vehicles. And already our friend Ned had plenty to say. First of all, viewers might know that a danger close fire mission is an artillery strike within 600 meters of a friendly position. Or at least this is what Wikipedia says. According to Ned, however, this isn't quite true, and the distance of a danger close strike varies greatly on the munitions being used. As Ned couldn't actually find any publicly available information on the specifics, he decided that to avoid a less than friendly visit by the FBI, he would spare us any further details. Ned also couldn't tell us whether the rounds used would actually be able to take down armored targets, stating that he wasn't allowed to talk about the ballistic capabilities of the munitions. However, judging by the way he said it, and looking at the publicly available information, a betting man probably wouldn't put their money on a tank. Although Ned actually thought the process of calling in the strike was mostly authentic, he noted that the explosions themselves were a bit too Hollywood. As he explains, the rounds themselves are designed to spread fragmentation as opposed to create an impressive fireball, which is why he thinks Gaz is a fucking idiot for not taking cover. Moving on to the loading screen, and Ned also points out that there are inconsistencies between whether the gunship is an AC-130H or the newer AC-130U, as both were being used at the time of the game's release. Basically, the plane is modeled after the H, but appears to be armed with the weapons from the U. Compared to later COD games, this title was basically made in a cave.
With a bunch of scraps!
So maybe we can forgive them for merging the two variants together. An interesting detail that Ned picked up immediately is that when Price first contacts the AC-130, he refers to it by the call sign Warhammer. However, he then refers to the crew as Wildfire at the start of the next mission. In all likelihood, the writers may have just pulled an all-nighter and forgot to change it. Starting the mission, we also see that Price and the team have activated IR strobes, which lets the player keep track of friendlies on the ground. According to Ned, however, IR strobes were rarely used to identify ground troops by the time he was operating in Afghanistan in the middle of the 2010s. This is because by then, insurgents on the ground also had access to night vision, and IR strobes would essentially just point out friendly troops to anyone who had them. When we actually asked Ned how on earth they managed to track friendly troops, he just replied, quote, "The short answer is that there is no trick. Being a sensor operator on a gunship is legitimately just really hard." With this in mind, however, Ned would also point out that the on-screen depictions of AC-130 footage is often more scuffed up than what it actually is, and he believes this is simply down to the shitty recording software being used on board. Others believe that this is just because the plane is partly made by Boeing. In any case, Ned compared the footage you might see on YouTube to the feed used on board, as like going from 240p to 1080p in terms of quality, which might explain how on earth a person could reasonably track friendly and enemy targets on the ground. In terms of the rules of engagement, Ned stated that the mission itself is pretty loose when it comes to just lighting up anyone that isn't a part of the Price gang. Continuing, he explained that there were a lot of rules for what they could and couldn't engage. Locations like churches, hospitals, and schools were entirely off limits. However, this protection could be revoked in the event that they were occupied by enemy troops. Ned would also state that the crew couldn't just start firing on hostiles before first checking in with JTAC on the ground. The only exception is when the crew believes that there is an imminent threat that can't wait to be called out, although this was stated to be a rare occurrence. Ned would explain that the process of tracking and engaging targets on the ground was very slow and methodical, and that 5 officers on board actually had consent switches, which could immediately prevent the weapons from firing. Speaking of the weapons, and as you might imagine, we also had a lot to break down. Firstly, the player actually assumes the role of one of 2 sensor operators in-game. This is not to be confused with the gunner crew, whose job is to load and maintain the weapons on board. What's also interesting is that although the sensor operator is the one to aim and fire the weapons, the fire control officer is actually the one to choose what is being fired. Apparently, this is to make it easier for the sensor operator to focus on scanning and engaging, and because the fire control officer is given specific training on the ballistic capabilities of each weapon. In-game, we also see that each weapon is locked to a specific zoom level, and as you might imagine, this isn't the case in real life. Ned also points out that the time from pulling the trigger to impacting on the ground is much faster in-game, which is likely to make it easier on the player. What is also quite interesting is how the weapons are depicted. For example, the smallest gun, the 25mm cannon, which Ned admitted was his favorite to fire, is depicted as much more accurate in-game. In fact, Ned stated that in terms of accuracy, you're much better off using the 40mm cannon, and that the 25mm is used as more of a psychological weapon. Ned actually recounts instances of enemy forces who thought they were being hit by mortar or artillery fire, and didn't realize they were actually being engaged by a gunship until they started using the 25mm. Another interesting fact is that apparently the 40mm cannon was also used as an anti-aircraft cannon in World War II. By the time the plane was being retired, the 40mm cannon became super hard to maintain, as gunners would have to salvage parts from decommissioned World War II vessels. Not only this, but the shells used also weren't made anymore, so the US Air Force had to actually buy them from an ally to maintain their stockpile. At one point in the mission, we also see that Price and the crew managed to commandeer civilian vehicles to drive to extraction. Apparently, this is actually pretty accurate, as Special Forces operators are trained to do this in real life. What Ned found funny, however, is that the IR strobes could then be seen on the vehicles being used, which obviously wouldn't actually work like this. Finally, another big plot hole in this mission is that in a real engagement, nothing is actually stopping Price and the gang from just taking 5 and letting their homies in the AC-130 clean up everything in the area. However, in Ned's own words, I'd say overall this is surprisingly good, especially considering that this came out in 2007. It might be hard to imagine, but this is just a fraction of what Ned was able to share. But in the interest of ever finishing the video, let's move on. Mission 9 sees the player thrown back with the Marines in the Middle East. By now, the tank with the funny drawing is back up and running, and the Marines are ready to push further into the city. Referring once again to our aforementioned light tank expert, this is the kind of situation that tankers really don't want, because urban warfare tends to be incredibly dangerous for a tank. This is actually represented pretty well in game, as at one point, the crew tells your squad it's likely to be ambushed if it pushes any further down the street. The rest of the mission is pretty standard from what we've seen from the Marines, with a lot of house-to-house fighting in a half-crumbling city. Eventually, however, the squad comes up to a scripted scene where they call out the location of a T-72 tank to the crew of their friendly Abrams. Obviously, we wanted to find out whether it would be actually possible to shoot through 2 walls and take out an enemy tank. So we showed it to our tank expert who said, quote, "A general tank round, like a general high explosive with no armor piercing, would do absolutely fuck all. It would probably just blow a hole in the first wall, then just scatter fragments everywhere. Like, it wouldn't do anything. Using a sabot round, or some sort of armor piercing round, you might get through the 2 walls, but the kinetic force behind the round that hit the tank would be fuck all. It would just make a loud bang probably, and they would just be like, what the fuck was that?" The dialogue also implies that the tank gunner switched to thermals, which allows them to see through walls, something our expert assures us is absolute bullshit. He would continue, quote, "To take an even further step back, that infantry, you would never ever get that close to a tank. You would stay well away from it, well out of its view, well out of its arc, anything else like that." Going back to intelligence, in the time period of the game, there would have been UAVs up 24/7, knowing what's going on. That tank would have been known to US intelligence and US Marines, and anyone on the ground. They very likely would have known that it was there. That would have been dealt with long before some poor fucking random Marines just stumble on a tank like, "Oh fuck, there's a fucking tank here." That would just not happen. Anyway, after the tank blows up, the Marines get word that Al-Assad has been found, but for real this time. They then board a chopper to go help in the assault. The start of the 10th mission sees the Marines take part in a final push to the capital city, a place that Al-Assad may or may not be in possession of a nuclear weapon. The start of the mission sees the player take aim with a Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, a weapon you very quickly realize is not something you want to be on the wrong side of. For a moment, it seemed as if Michael Bay may have been hired to direct this mission, as the player is able to immediately melt enemy infantry, anti-air guns, and even enemy armor. That is, until we did about 5 seconds of research and discovered that a Mark 19 is designed to penetrate light infantry vehicles. Not only this, but newer models are actually rated to take out small UAVs at up to 700 meters. You kinda have to wonder why you'd even bother using anything else. In any case, our tank expert was less concerned with the effectiveness of the Mark 19 in-game, but did however find it unrealistic that they'd use such a weapon weapon in an urban environment, considering the high chance of civilian casualties. In any case, the mission sees the player periodically enter and exit the helicopter depending on the objective, while radio chatter indicates that Al-Assad's nuke could go off at any minute. Near the tail end of the mission, a friendly helicopter gets hit and crashes in the middle of the street. Ignoring the potential nuclear threat, the Marines land and attempt to save the only woman you'll see in the entire game. After a successful rescue, the squad takes off, which is when we witness the most memorable part of the entire campaign.
We have a confirmed Everyone hang on!
The player awakes in the wreckage of the helicopter. The rest of your squad is presumed dead. Slowly crawling outside, you witness the sheer destruction of the nuclear blast. There are no signs of life anywhere. The world is on fire. They say that Marines don't die, they just regroup in hell, and that's exactly where you've landed. The player falls to the ground, the screen fades to white, and your character ends with the Middle Eastern storyline. For the people playing this in 2007, this shit was fucking crazy. The next intelligence cutscene shows that the nuke went off around the border of Iraq and Iran, which isn't in Saudi Arabia like the game previously shows. We should probably remind viewers that only a few years before this game came out, the US invaded Iraq on the pretext that Saddam Hussein was armed with nuclear weapons, something that turned out to be complete bullshit. As you might imagine, the developers probably didn't want to specifically name Middle Eastern countries when their story actually involves a nuke going off and wiping out an entire city. In any case, the Marines are wiped out, so we're back with our SAS crew. Nikolai basically tells the boys that Al-Assad is too much of a bitch to blow himself up, and that he knows of an ultra-nationalist safe house in Azerbaijan, where he might be hiding. With no other leads, the Price crew once again link up with the Russian loyalists, and start their assault on the small town. The mission itself is pretty open-ended by COD standards, letting the player search each house one by one for sign of Al-Assad. Notably, the mission also lets the player call in helicopter support every minute or so, which again was pretty crazy back in 2007. Modern Warfare really did walk so Helldivers could run. Also, we need to give serious props to whoever made the shotguns in this game, because even by today's standards, they just feel so fucking crunchy. By the end of the mission, you've finally come to an old barn, and after Price single-handedly clears the room with a pistol, the team captures Al-Assad alive. Price then gets to work interrogating Al-Assad to find out who the fuck gave him a nuke. During this very one-sided conversation, however, Al-Assad gets a phone call from none other than Imran Zakhaev, a man who Price immediately recognizes as the real mastermind of the nuclear blast. Seeing no more use for Al-Assad, Price shoots him in the head, and prepares to tell us a fun little story. In 1996, 15 years before Modern Warfare takes place, British intelligence discovers that Imran Zakhaev had been selling spent fuel rods from the Chernobyl disaster to whoever had enough money. A then Lieutenant Price, under the command of a Captain Macmillan, would be sent to the ghost town of Pripyat to assassinate Zakhaev, something Price describes as the first state-sanctioned assassination since World War II. This mission would go on to be the most iconic in the franchise's history. Welcome to All Gillied Up. The mission begins as a fade from black into a grass field in the abandoned ghost town of Pripyat. Unknown to the player, Captain Macmillan has been in plain sight the entire time, and as he stands up, you immediately recognize how effective a ghillie suit can be. The two of you move along, and Macmillan tells you to be careful of radiation, once again reminding us why an entire city has been abandoned. In our first encounter with the enemy, Macmillan tells the player to take out one of the soldiers while the other isn't looking, showing us that if there's no body, there's no crime. According to the developers speaking years after the game's release, usually an encounter like this would take maybe 1 day to put together, but this very short sequence would take game designer Mohamed Alavi 3 whole weeks. As he explained in an interview with the channel Game Brain, Modern Warfare just wasn't designed with stealth gameplay in mind, and the AI didn't actually have any way to accommodate it. In fact, Alavi had to request mocap animations for things as simple as walking or jogging, because the faster-paced nature of the rest of the game never necessitated a walking animation in the first place. The reason it took so long is because Alavi had to essentially create an entire stealth system for the game, while some other levels had as few as 5,000 lines of script, which was already crazy compared to their previous titles. The first 2 minutes of this mission already necessitated 10,000 lines of script, an absolutely gargantuan task. What makes it even more impressive is that Mohamed Alavi, officially a level designer, wasn't even supposed to be working on enemy AI at all, and he only managed to make it work because it took 3 weeks before the more senior developers caught on to what he was doing. Jumping back into the mission, Price and Macmillan sneak their way through the first batch of enemies, and end up in an open field. Macmillan then tells the player to hit the deck, before an entire patrol of enemies start walking directly over your head. Although only a minute long, this sequence seems to last for an eternity, as you're now at the mercy of your ghillie suits, the enemy pathing, and sheer blind luck. After the enemies pass, you then keep moving along, until you eventually reach the next encounter. According to Alavi, this mission was intentionally spread out a lot more than most levels within Modern Warfare, and this was designed to keep the stealth fantasy more believable. If a player was caught and had to go loud, it would be more convincing that the following enemies didn't know you were around, if you traveled far enough between each encounter. It's also a fun little detail that if you do slip up and go loud, Macmillan will roast the player for being a bumbling idiot.
Stealth doesn't mean anything to you, does it?
After you move a little further, Macmillan decides to bonk a soldier in the face before eventually coming to an entire convoy that you'd clearly have no hope in fighting. The realism of this next scene, especially the plan to sprint directly into the middle of an enemy convoy dressed as a bush, is pretty far-fetched. However, the developers wanted to make this mission as intense as possible, and they sure weren't fucking around. As crazy as it may sound, the concept of this mission was actually voted as the least interesting internally at the time, and even Mohamed Alavi initially thought that it sounded kinda boring. For context, the one other mission he designed was Crew Expendable, the game's first level, which saw the player narrowly escape a sinking cargo ship. Just coming off of his work on that, it was probably unthinkable that a mission about quietly sneaking through grassy fields would end up being lauded as one of gaming's best levels. Shortly after sneaking past the convoy, Macmillan calls out a sniper on top of a fire escape. As the player takes him down, you actually fire the very last necessary bullet for the entire mission. In fact, even in the playthrough you've been watching which saw us go loud, we only fired a total of 17 bullets for the whole level. Price and Macmillan then make their way through a bunch of abandoned Soviet buildings until eventually...
Say the line, Bart!
Look at this place. 50,000 people used to live in the city. Now it's a ghost town.
Most viewers probably don't remember the ending to this mission, because ultimately it's not all that memorable. Macmillan just points to an abandoned hotel and tells Price that's where they'll set up. According to Alavi, he personally hated the end of this mission, because he unfortunately never got time to finish it. In a later interview, he explained that he wanted to flesh out the interior of the hotel, and actually show Price and Macmillan set up their sniping perch. It's almost insane to think that a mission this iconic was never actually finished. For those of you wondering, Mohamed Alavi, as well as Preston Glenn, who also worked on this level, would both go on to join Respawn Entertainment in the Great Ship Jump of 2010, an event we'll talk about if we ever do a video on Modern Warfare 2. After this mission, Alavi would actually go on to design the infamous No Russian level for the next game, as well as push Respawn Entertainment into developing the iconic extended introductions in Titanfall 1's campaign. These days, Alavi is actually the lead designer of Wildlight Entertainment, a studio which has yet to release anything, but has its ranks stacked with developers from Call of Duty, Titanfall, and Apex Legends. Looking back, it's pretty crazy that the 100-person team that made Modern Warfare would go on to effectively shape an entire generation of shooters. Not only because their title was so influential, but because nearly 20 years later, it seems like half of the shooter market is led by someone who worked on Modern Warfare. In the next mission cutscene, we see Price and and Macmillan patiently wait 3 days to finally get a shot at Zakhaev. And eventually, it's showtime. With Macmillan acting as your spotter, Price attempts a shot which, according to a COD fan site, is roughly 900 meters. Although a fucking hard shot, confirmed kills had exceeded this distance by the time this game had been released, making this something of a realistic depiction in-game. As a side note, the Macmillan TAC-50 actually holds quite a few records on the longest confirmed kill scoreboard, which might be the origin of his name. To hype you up for the shot, Macmillan tells the player to account for wind speed, humidity, and even the rotation of the Earth. He also says, no pressure, but he's also probably not sticking around very long. After a helicopter comes into frame and acts all goofy, literally turning to look in both directions, you eventually get a clear shot at Zakhaev, and end up blowing off his arm. Macmillan then tells you, fuck it, close enough, and the both of you call the assassination a success. Anyway, Zakhaev's boys ape the pair almost immediately, and your hiding spot is blown to shit less than 30 seconds after you take the shot. The rest of the mission has Price and Macmillan speedrun their way to the extraction 700 meters away, giving the player 20 minutes to get there. Around 5 minutes into the mission, another helicopter gets in your way, and using the power of friendship, you manage to take it down by shooting out the pilot. This unfortunately turns into a short-lived victory, as although you're on a very strict time limit, Macmillan finds it in his best interest to walk away like a GTA San Andreas character, which ends up getting his legs fucked up. Not wanting to leave your battle buddy behind, Price ends up carrying Macmillan for the rest of the mission, with the player being able to put him down whenever things get a little hairy. Macmillan's leg injuries certainly don't make him any less accurate, as he'll hold his own if you provide him with good enough sightlines. To go a little bit off topic, we recorded our playthrough on the lowest difficulty. We didn't end up dying all that often, and for those who might not remember, each death screen provides the player with a famous quote usually regarding the nature of war. In this instance, for example, we have, "Whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain." Wow, what a very astute and relevant quote. I wonder who said such a wise and discerning "Oh no!" Eventually, the pair make it to a Ferris wheel, a location which was inspired by an actual Ferris wheel in the Pripyat amusement park. This is your extraction point. This is where you make your last stand, putting Macmillan up on a cozy little hill and setting up a sea of claymores. The pair of you hold out until US Marines come to pick you up. Respect gained. Great success. Unfortunately, we never get to see Macmillan in action after this mission, but it's easy to see how Captain Price became so effective when this guy was his mentor. Jumping back to the modern day, Captain Price then says his famous line, "Somehow, Imran Zakhaev returned." It also seems as if he took all fucking night to tell his story from Pripyat, because now it's daytime and the ultranationalists have regrouped to heroically save Al-Assad. You know, that guy Price just shot in the fucking head. The mission is structured as a kind of last stand to hold out for extraction, where Price, Gaz, and Soap, and forgettable squad members 1 and 2, are tasked with staying alive until help can arrive. The good news is that it seems the team didn't spend the whole 8 hours following Al-Assad's death just listening to Price's war stories, but instead use this time to set up their defenses. Their grand plan is to use the prep time to pretend to be a larger force than they are. Captain Price is a fan of Sun Tzu, and a subscriber to the "fuck it we ball" military doctrine, and this plan certainly demonstrates it best. This level is a greatest hits type mission when looking at this game specifically, because it pretty much just asks the player to do all the cool shit it spent the last 3 hours teaching you how to do. Man a machine gun, blow up a field of explosives, call in air support, and take out tanks with a Javelin rocket launcher. Once again, it's not entirely clear where they managed to get a Javelin in the middle of Azerbaijan, so we can only assume they brought it with them and stashed it a few missions ago. This type of mission design is almost a product of its time when it comes to Call of Duty games. In later titles, it would almost be strange to play an entire mission without a scripted room breach, or being thrown around in a cutscene, but not in good old 2007. Anyway, the boys get to the top of the hill to the LZ, but unfortunately the extraction pilot says, "Nah, fuck that, the top of the hill is way too dangerous. It'll be way better to pick you up at the bottom of the hill."
Oh, we were right there, man!
By now, it's obvious that neither myself, Krusty the editor, or Swag the writer has ever actually spent time in the military. However, just from our experience of talking to many people who have, the plot point of making the team fight their way back down the hill might be the single most realistic part of this game's story. So the squad fight their way all the way down to the bottom, and wouldn't you know, the team that picks you up are the remnants of the Marines that got wiped out by the nuke. By that, it's pretty much just Griggs. Griggs is now the Captain Price of the Marines. Marines. After getting the fuck out of Azerbaijan, the SAS and Marines team up to take down Imran Zakhaev. But unfortunately, no one knows where he is. The good news, however, is that intelligence did manage to track down his son, Viktor Zakhaev, the field commander of the ultranationalist ground forces. The team figures that Viktor will know where his father is hiding, so they pack their bags for another trip to Russia. Now is probably a good time to mention that the entire game takes place over just 6 days. So far, Captain Price's gang have trained in the UK, escaped a sinking ship in the Bering Strait, been shot down over Russia, killed Al-Assad in Azerbaijan, then gone back to Russia, and we're only just past the 5-day mark. On the ground, Price's joint task force then meets up with Komarov's loyalists, who then take them to a servo acting as a vehicle checkpoint. The team then gives the guards a fatal case of lead poisoning before then going to work cleaning up the outpost. The plan is to change into Russian uniforms and ambush Viktor Zakhaev's convoy as they pass through. We could probably talk about how dressing in an enemy uniform is a war crime, but considering these guys just nuked a fucking capital city only 2 days ago, even the most peace-loving hippies would probably let this slide. Anyway, Price has the forethought to put Komarov's men in any position where someone would actually have to speak Russian, which turned out to be a good call, because it would only take 2 hours before Viktor Zakhaev shows up. The ensuing firefight sees the team get the drop on the ultranationalist troops, but with Viktor making a run for it and the enemy reinforcements showing up, Price makes the heroic decision to make Soap go get him. The player then Barry Allens their way through the town, before eventually chasing Viktor into a depressing commie block-style apartment building. There's probably something to be said about Viktor taking refuge in a scuffed-up building that perfectly represents the glory of a nation he's fighting so hard to re-establish. Maybe Captain Price just had to show Viktor that Vladimir Putin quote didn't age too well. After blasting their way through the apartment building, the team eventually corners Viktor on the roof. It's not clear how the fuck everyone else managed to beat you here, but screw it. Price isn't known to fuck around. Soap is then given the honor of taking Viktor in alive, but not before he finds a 14th reason why and becomes another statistic in Russia's suicide epidemic. I mean, Jesus Christ. Look at this shit. Everyone then stands around wondering what the fuck to do now. But Price is like, nah, don't worry. I know Imran Zakhaev. He's probably just going to try launching more nukes. The next cutscene has Zakhaev go on a speech about how the West has destroyed Russia's economy, defaced its honor, and banged his mum. All that same type of shit Vladimir Putin has been saying since his invasion of Ukraine. They say life imitates art, so we only have to assume Putin was getting called all kinds of slurs over Xbox Live back in the day. With this in mind, the team's next mission sees them drop into the Altai Mountains near a nuclear launch site. But since Griggs fucked it up somehow, the team have to go find him before the bad guys do. The SAS lads make their way to a small village where Griggs' distress signal is coming from, and just decide to start clearing houses one at a time until they find him. This section is very reminiscent of the 2019 remake level Clean House, where British Special Forces have to clear out a London townhouse room by room. When comparing both missions side by side, it's fucking crazy how far this type of scripted gameplay progressed in just 12 years. The team eventually finds Griggs being held hostage by the ultranationalists, and while setting him free, Price really solidifies himself as the main character for the entire trilogy.
About damn time. I was starting to think you guys were gonna leave me behind.
That was my first thought, but your ass had all the C4.
Later in the mission, when we blow up a power line tower, we find out that Soap was the one with the C4 this whole time, meaning either Price was joking or he just forgot who was carrying it. Gaz then uses the Batman anti-fence spray and falls over like a fucking dumbass, before the team then meet up with an American sniper team. Captain Price's fan meetup doesn't last long, however, because right off the back of his son's death, Zakhaev fires 2 nukes from the launch facility to get his revenge. In the next cutscene, we see that the missiles are on track to hit the eastern seaboard of the United States, with the warheads estimated to wipe out 41 million people within the next few hours. In the meantime, John Price and company, with the help of enormous saws they definitely had the whole time, start their assault on the launch center to get to the control room. At this stage, we have to remember that Russia is still gripped by a civil war, meaning Zakhaev is still considered a rogue agent in the eyes of the loyalists. With this in mind, while we're tasked fighting our way into a nuclear launch site, the higher-ups have to somehow convince the Russian loyalists to hand hand over the abort codes before it's too late. To find out whether this was a realistic scenario, we once again went to our magic book of news contacts and found ourselves a guy named Austin, a former US Air Force electronic warfare systems technician. Austin spent 7 years working with systems designed to jam and track missiles, so we figured he'd be more than qualified to break down this particular plot point. Austin firstly identified the missiles used as the RT-2P-M2 Topol M SS-27 ICBM, which immediately reaffirmed that we found the right guy for the job, as they're designed to travel in low orbit at a speed of up to 27,000 kilometers an hour. Austin estimated that the flight time from the Caucasus Mountains to New York City at around 25 minutes, give or take 5 minutes. If you were as scared shitless as we were learning this, he would then go on to say that with the help of nuclear submarines, the United States currently has the capability to nuke anywhere in the world within 5 minutes. US nuclear policy also states that if nuclear weapons are used against either the US or an ally, it would retaliate twofold against the aggressor. So the official protocol for the 2 missiles launched in-game would be to fire 4 back in kind. Once again, however, this is a bit of a grey area in-game, as Imran Zakhaev isn't actually the leader of Russia, at least not in any capacity that the United States would recognize. Considering that literally days earlier a nuke went off in the Middle East, Austin theorized that constant communication between the loyalists and the United States would mean that no such retaliation would occur. In-game at least, the United States does not retaliate. Stopping the nukes themselves is actually another plot point entirely, as real nuclear weapons don't have abort codes, and they cannot be called off once fired. As Austin explains, quote, "Once these weapons are deployed, launched, there is no abort, no changing the target. Everything is locked in. These are the most powerful weapons that exist, and their use is absolute. If the host nation decides to use them, they cannot risk a cyber attack or other methods being able to self-destruct or change targets. Imagine a nuclear war where one side is able to hack the other's nuclear weapons to detonate as soon as they leave the silo, or retarget to hit their own city." With all of this being said, the game's mission for Captain Price's squad to storm the launch site and input the abort codes might be the single biggest plot hole in this game. Comparing it to what would actually happen, however, this in-game depiction is certainly more exciting. In Austin's opinion, the ICBMs would very likely be taken down by NATO's defense system before they even make it past Europe. In this sense, it would not be Soap, Gaz, and Captain Price taking out the nukes, but rather in Austin's own words, quote, "Some depressed, hopped up on monster 19-year-old airman sitting in the super bunker that is the Mount Cheyenne complex that would use a computer." End quote. I don't know about you guys, but it sure would be cool to get a full Zampella cut, where you play a relatively monotonous mission as a depressed teenage airman who saves the world. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, and the writers didn't expect a band of idiots like us to contact a niche military expert 2 decades later to pick apart their action movie style plot. Instead, the game puts you in a race against time to storm the launch facility and input the abort codes that definitely exist in real life. Unfortunately, when you strip away the context, this mission might be the least interesting in the game. I guess it might be a testament to the developers that they somehow made lying down in some grass more exciting than single-handedly blowing up a tank with a hand-placed C4 charge. In any case, our recorded playthrough of this mission was only around 5 minutes long, so it's likely that the level might have been intended to be placed at the end of the last mission or at the beginning of the next one, but that's just pure unfounded speculation. At the end of the mission, the team used those aforementioned saws to cut into the exhaust vents, and then you rappel down to complete the level. At the start of the next mission, we're told that the higher-ups have acquired the abort codes from the loyalists, but your team only has a few minutes before the missiles make impact. This mission is called "No Fighting in the War Room," a reference to this line from the 1964 film Dr. Strangelove.
Hey, you war machine. Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Unique to this mission, the player also gets an overt countdown timer for how long you have to save the world. On our recruit run, the timer was 15 minutes, but those playing on veteran have this time shaved down to just 9 minutes. First impressions were that this mission wasn't necessarily Infinity Ward's best work, but it's much more exciting when the difficulty is cranked up and the player genuinely needs to play aggressively to meet their deadline. To increase this sense of urgency, the middle of the mission has a sequence where another missile launch threatens to incinerate your whole squad. Luckily, the ever-heroic Captain Price manages to close the door behind you, saving everyone from being turned into whatever the fuck those Japanese chefs are cooking. Immediately after, however, the gang gets held up by a blast door which Gaz opens remotely. Unfortunately, for potentially the fate of the entire world, this is the slowest door in existence, and it takes half a minute to open it just enough to slip inside. It's not clear whether these doors were put in to cover technical limitations, a way to build tension, or for just comedic effect, but they work pretty well as all of the above. Not soon after, the team make their way to the far east corner of the control room, where you're tasked with blowing up the wall to get inside. Living up to the mission's name, Price immediately goes,
No fucking fighting!
Good. Get the fuck in.
The room itself is pretty Hollywood, with a big red star on the wall, lines of NASA-like terminals and an enormous screen to map out the trajectory of the nukes. You're then tasked with inputting the abort codes, which is just done at a regular-ass beige keyboard. You'd assume that aborting a nuke would be done with some specialized terminal or dedicated button, but I guess why wouldn't it be some $15 keyboard you picked up at Walmart? In 2011, a special edition of Modern Warfare 3 would also include Soap's journal, and on one page it actually has the abort codes he uses to stop the nukes. From a quick count, there are 111 Cyrillic characters written down, and they all appear to be entirely random, not spelling out any words or sentences. With this in mind, Soap manages to input all 111 characters in 3 seconds just from memory without making a single mistake. What an absolute mad lad. After a nuclear apocalypse is aborted, we then find that Zakhaev is making his escape by helicopter.
I think if we all just take a couple of deep breaths here and just try to...
But seeing as the nukes are no longer a problem, the team decide to make their way to the vehicle depot to get the fuck out of Dodge. The game's last mission, appropriately called Game Over, is an on-rails car chase where the team does its best to make their way to the evac point.
Faceplate, this is Bravo 6.
Although this kind of heavily scripted car chase set-piece gameplay would later become far more common, it was once again one of those missions that landed Modern Warfare its Game of the Year award. Despite the format, this mission is still a handful of fail states if certain conditions aren't met. For example, throughout the chase, the Price crew are constantly harassed by a Hind helicopter. At one point, the player is given an RPG to shoot it down, but this is mostly just smoke and mirrors. The game will never actually let the player make a hit. However, if no attempt is made to shoot it down, the Hind will blow up the player's vehicle. Eventually, the Hind will blow up a bridge as the Price gang attempt to cross, a scene which quickly turns into a tense final stand for all the remaining characters on your squad. Over the radio, you hear that your own chopper support is unavailable. However, Sergeant Komarov's loyalists are on the way to assist. The team are then forced to stand their ground until support arrives, a plan that quickly goes to shit once a Hind rocket lands close to your position. After momentarily falling unconscious, you awake to see Griggs attempting to pull you to safety, his last heroic act before he's shot and killed. Turning toward the player's fearless leader, and Price also appears to be unable to stand up, presumably suffering just as much in the blast as the player. Now turning to the side of the ultranationalists, and Imran Zakhaev has now landed, presumably to finish you off. You might think that he'd be doing his best to escape by now, but we know for a fact he's heavily motivated by revenge. Personally killing the guy who shot off his arm and aborted his nukes is very much in character. Zakhaev goes on to shoot Gaz, while his bodyguards would execute the rest of your squad. And just when it looks like you're next on the chopping block, the Hind unexpectedly explodes. Seizing this opportunity, Price quickly slides over his trusty 1911 to Soap, who then finally kills Zakhaev and his men. As viewers might remember, the first time we see Zakhaev is when he gives Al-Assad a pistol to kill John President. With Price handing you a pistol to kill Zakhaev, it marks what is perhaps the perfect end to the character, and as a symbolic passing of the torch going into the next game. But we'll get to that bridge when and if we get there. Although Zakhaev is dead, the only two survivors of your team are you and Price. With this being said, the player is in critical condition and is immediately airlifted with the help of Komarov, and the last time we see Price, he's receiving chest compressions from a loyalist soldier. As we're hoisted into the sky, we learn over a news report that the nuclear launch was covered up and explained as a simple missile test. The report also mentions that there is a suspected leadership struggle within the ultranationalist party, while the search for the cargo ship you blew up 6 days earlier has now been called off. Roll credits. Okay, It may have been 2007, but this was a unique piece of media that didn't roll credits with Linkin Park. The track we actually hear is Deep and Hard, which, as a fun fact, is performed by the voice actor of Griggs, Mark Grigsby. Grigsby himself is another larger-than-life figure in the shooter industry, and he was initially on the team as the lead animator before taking on these more theatrical roles. Grigsby would be one of the devs who would be part of the Great Titanfall migration, following the release of Modern Warfare 2, where he would go on to work on Titanfall 1 and 2. In 2017, Grigsby would then return to Infinity Ward, where he would very fittingly take the role of animation director of the rebooted versions of Modern Warfare 1 and 2. Grigsby now serves as the studio head, meaning to make this game a little more special, the head of Infinity Ward has been with us on this adventure the whole time. Of course, viewers will know that Game Over isn't the real last mission of the game, with completion unlocking the bonus mission, Mile High Club. The mission is only a few minutes long, and sees the players speedrun their way through a two-story plane to save a VIP being held hostage. This mission is a bit harder to grasp in the continuity of the Modern Warfare storyline, because we know it occurs before the events of Modern Warfare 2, but where or why is hard to say. Supposedly, this is the very first mission the team actually finished, and was intended to be placed near the start of the game, but it didn't fit due to the pacing. Instead of cutting it, they just kept it as a bonus epilogue mission, and that was that. The only reason the mission doesn't really make sense in the context of the Modern Warfare story, however, is that at the start of the mission, we hear this exchange.
We're going deep and we're going hard. Surely you can't be serious. I'm serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Firstly, viewers might recognize this line as a reference to this other scene from the 1980s film Airplane, or Flying High, depending on where you live.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Secondly, as we hear Gaz's voice, we are led to assume that this mission takes place before the events of Modern Warfare. Alternatively, as Gaz's voice actor, Craig Fairbass, comes back in the second game to voice the now iconic Simon Ghost Riley, it's possible that we're instead on this mission with Ghost before the start of Modern Warfare 2. A third explanation is that because Fairbass also voiced Walcroft, who was with the Price crew from the very first mission, he might be the one we hear on this mission. But that's just a theory. A game theory. A bit of fun trivia about this mission is that it actually inspired the entire Spec Ops mode in Modern Warfare 2. Smaller, bite-sized missions which the developers could make outside of the bounds of plot continuity. YouTube was a very different place back then, and it didn't have idiots like us spending months of our lives breaking down minuscule plot holes in games that came out nearly 2 decades ago. Looking back at this game's enormous critical and commercial success, it might be surprising to know that trying to get this game made took some serious convincing by the developers. When the big trio of Jason West, Vince Zampella, and Grant Collier founded Infinity Ward in 2002, they had just come off the back of developing Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Allied Assault in itself was lightning in a bottle at the time, as somehow these young guys had managed to pull off this insane World War II game, co-written by Steven fucking Spielberg of all people. Not happy with EA as their publisher, the entire Allied Assault team would move over to Infinity Ward upon its creation, where the new studio was given $1.5 million by Activision for a 30% stake in the company. The guy at Activision who made that deal has probably bought his 12th yacht by now. Actually, who was in charge at the time? Oh, motherfucker! Knowing Kotick was in charge actually makes a lot of sense, because when the team was about to start working on the first Call of Duty, they actually didn't want it to be set in World War II at all. In fact, they wanted Modern Warfare to be the first game in the series. Seeing how successful Allied Assault was, however, Activision said, "Okay, how about you make us one World War II game, then you can make what you want when that's done." With $1.5 million on the line, the team was like, "Okay, fair enough, get to work, lads." Fast forward to the next year, and Call of Duty was released to critical acclaim, going on to sell 4.5 million copies, a fucking bonkers return on investment for Activision. The team then say to Activision, "Hey, we finished the game like you said, can we make our modern shooter now?" Activision would then reply, "Ooh, actually Call of Duty landed 80 Game of the Year awards and made a mountain of money. We'd really like you to make us a World War II based sequel." At the time, Microsoft didn't have a Halo title for the launch of the Xbox 360. 360 and was looking for a shooter to fill that void. Activision figured that Call of Duty 2 could be this big next-gen shooter launch title for the Xbox 360. So once again, they volunteered Infinity Ward for the job. So the team knuckled down again and made Call of Duty 2. And by 2005, the game would once again release to critical acclaim and bonkers sales numbers. It actually stayed as the single most played game on Xbox Live for 14 months straight after its release. The team once again sat down with Activision, who said, "Jason, Vince, baby, I love you guys. Everyone loves you guys. But listen, we've been swimming in money for years now, so we'd really love it if you made a third World War II game for us." But the developers said, "Fuck that. We're making Modern Warfare. If you want a World War II game, get someone else to do it." So Activision said, "Fine, we'll get Treyarch to do it. The guys who made Kelly Slater's Pro Surfer and Spider-Man 2. So Infinity Ward got to make Modern Warfare, a game which would triple the previous sales titles' figures, review better than any of its titles that came before, and finally let the team make what they wanted to in the first place. Its wild success sure didn't stop Activision from doing its absolute best to sabotage itself, however, and friction between the developers and the publisher would be cranked to 11 during the development of Modern Warfare 2. But that's a story for another time. Just while we've got the credits rolling, as you might imagine, this video took a really long time to make. In fact, this is the biggest video we've made on this channel, and it's not even close. We started making this in the dead middle of 2024, so when you look at the release date in the description, you'll know how much work went into making it a reality. Swag himself actually found it pretty interesting breaking down the plot, comparing it with real-life events, and finding relevant experts to answer our stupid questions. If the video does well, and there's enough support, maybe we'll start on a Modern Warfare 2 video, a game which arguably has more relevance with the events we're seeing today. As you might imagine, a video like this is also really fucking expensive. And honestly, Krusty the editor especially earned his fucking payday with this one. This is why viewers who want to support what we do can do so through the Patreon link in the description. YouTube really doesn't encourage videos that take this long to make, so supporters like yourselves really give us the luxury to just swing for the fences, even if it might take an ungodly amount of time to actually get to the finish line. With this in mind, on behalf of myself, Krusty, and Swag, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.